Copyright University of Auckland, all rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under licence. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not sell, alter or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, e ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hau, e whā, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you for your welcome, and I'm really pleased to be here. I think it's always nice to have a connection with the University of Auckland and the Early Years Research Centre at the University of Waikato, and let's hope there are more of these kind of opportunities for us to get together. My presentation today is mainly about the research that I've been doing, or the evaluation that I've been leading on the Ministry of Education participation program in early childhood education. And so I'm going to particularly bring to you today some of the findings from mainly interviews with families who were part of the program, but also I want to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that I see for practice and some of the challenges for policy in New Zealand. And I do need to say that the findings have been published and they're on the Education Count's website, or some of them have been. The ideas about policy directions are my ideas, not the Ministry of Education ideas. So just make that very clear. So this is what I'm going to do in the presentation. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the participation program, first of all, and then particularly from the family's point of view, what were the barriers that stopped them or hindered them from attending early childhood or thinking about it, and then also enrolling in early childhood, and what helped them to make that decision. I want to talk particularly about one of the initiatives, which is called Engaging Priority Families, and the role that they played as brokers in acting as advocates and intermediaries for families. And then I'll go on a little bit on practice and policy and thoughts about advocacy. Okay, so priority families is a term used by the Ministry of Education, and in this particular case they were talking mainly about Māori and Pacifica children and children from low socioeconomic communities who were not participating in early childhood education. And the Ministry's approach was to develop a range of 6 initiatives to address what they saw as the barriers to early childhood participation and raise participation. And so the way they did this on a community basis. They selected communities where the Ministry of Education's stats of children starting school showed that there was a high percentage of children who had not had any early childhood experience beforehand. And they mapped those in New Zealand, and not surprisingly, the areas that had low participation also were the most deprived areas in New Zealand in terms of unemployment, low income, housing issues and health problems. So there was a whole lot of issues in those communities. Right. So the 4 initiatives that I particularly will focus on, engaging priority families, was where a coordinator is appointed who is working with 3- and 4-year-old families with 3- and 4-year-old children who are not at early childhood education. And some of them were nearly school age when they came into the program, others were 3-year-olds. Supported playgroups, people know what playgroups are. Supported playgroups have a coordinator who works with the playgroup, who's paid to do that role. TAP is Targeted Assistance for Provision, and that is a Ministry of Education grant which is for building purposes. So some new centres have been built and some existing centres have been expanded, so that sometimes things like a whānau room has been built. I think some people have used TAP funds also for buying vans for transport, which I think is another issue. And then there's a home-based initiative, and there are some other ones as well, but that's what I'll talk about. So I guess in terms of, if you look at our theoretical approach, we were really rather struck on the idea of families in terms of funds of knowledge and cultural capital, and the way in which characterises families in terms of, you know, their own resources that are within them, and the ways in which providers worked with the families, whether they had a deficit approach or whether they took an empowering approach, and were really interested to find out about those families and what they had going for them. So, just some of the findings about barriers to participation. And if you look at that list there, you'll see most of the barriers didn't reside within the families themselves. They were more to do with the way in which early childhood is provided and funded and organised. And actually this finding is consistent with other research, and I just have been in Australia recently where it was almost remarkably exactly the same barriers were found in a study done by the University of Western Sydney about families. So I'm going to go through each of those in turn, so I'm not going to talk a lot about them at the moment. But you can see that right down at the bottom of the list is the kind of personal barriers. And that was pretty well the rank order of what came through from interviews with families, interviews with the providers of the participation initiatives, and surveys of families and providers. So it was consistent throughout the 3 stages. So first of all, these barriers were within systems or services that made them inaccessible. And the top of the list was cost. And it wasn't just the cost of fees, it was the cost of attending. So transport, you will see, is there, but if you had to get transport to get to an early childhood centre and you're a very low income, then that is maybe too difficult. But it was also the cost of things like having to provide a lunch or something like that. Now, the fees issue, I think, is a really important one, and that's one that I think policy should be looking at, and we should be looking at some of the models that are used overseas. Because we have a 20 hours ECE policy, in fact, often those 20 hours are not free. And we found, not only in this study, but in surveys that I have done over the time since 20 hours free early childhood was implemented in 2007, that one of the things that some providers do is they say, yeah, you can have the 20 hours free, but you have to attend for 30 hours, and the extra 10 hours costs quite a lot more, and that's beyond the reach of these families. We found out about other charges too, like picking up a child late. You might be charged $12 to $15 for 10 minutes over time. And that is really also, as soon as that happens, people are out of there. They, can't afford to pay that. So the location is another issue. sometimes if the centre isn't in the locality that people want, that's a problem. The service is not meeting the needs of the families, and that is in terms of the hours that you have to attend, or it might be in terms of the cultural responsiveness. We also found, and I found this quite shocking really, early childhood services not welcoming, and when you think about te whāriki and how important welcoming is, and we had a quote from a provider there who's talking about centres that won't take these children, they don't want the problems, and they see that bringing school sores and whatever, so they shy away. So we had a lot of comments like that. And parents, you know, when they first walk in the door, just not feeling that they were very welcomed. So that quote there, that parent was left to sit on a child's seat and nobody paid attention to her. I think there were a lot of personal reasons why not to enrol in ECE, and that sometimes came from lack of knowledge. You don't know what to do. How do you enrol? What's the process that you do? Or parents talked about feeling shy. They didn't. It was too daunting to walk in the door, really. Some parents also felt that they might have to sign a document, and they were worried about their literacy skills, whether they could read it or whether they would be able to sign it. And then what were the expectations? So this is all about information. What is expected once I have signed? The providers were more likely to emphasise transients, so families who were moving around a lot, and we've found that, you know, in our latest round where we're trying to follow some children through into school, and actually just keeping track of where they've gone has been really difficult to do. And they talked also about families wanting to be under the radar. So they might be on a benefit or something, and they maybe didn't want to come to the notice of government agencies, so they wanted to remain incognito. Everyone talked about poverty as being a real issue and a kind of underlying problem. And I guess the other really strong thing that came through was that overwhelming feeling that you might be judged, or that you would be judged, that people were prejudiced about you, and also a real concern that your child would be safe within the early childhood centre. Okay. So what we've seen there is that actually a lot of the barriers are out there. They're things that we as a society, as a country, can do something about. And often also there was a mismatch between what was available in the community and what that family wanted and what would attract families. I think also there was a bit of an uncontested assumption that everyone should attend early childhood, and some families had cultural reasons why they wanted their children to be at home, maybe to learn the language of their home language. And here are some quotes, I think. This was a really overriding concern. Will my child be safe? Can the adults in the early childhood setting be trusted? And I think early childhood services have a culture of their own, and they have their own values, their own curriculum, their way of teaching and learning, and often these are implicit, they're not made explicit to families. So I thought, here are some of the challenges in terms of practice, and it really goes back to belonging. What works to create a sense of belonging, and what came through from the families we interviewed when they had found a centre that they really liked. It was a warm and friendly welcome. It was staff showing an interest when they walked in the door, talking to the parent and the child, and really personalising the approach. And you can see there's a parent there talking about how fabulous it was when she walked into that centre. They also like to have, this came through, clear explanations of what goes on here. I felt welcome when I came here. The first day the manager let me in, showed me where the kids were, showed me the rooms, how to fill in the papers. She explained everything to me, and I liked it when she explained everything. I liked it when I came in. And we had lots of comments like that. This is just a kind of snapshot of them. Also important was their own child's reaction when they went there. So this parent had been to 2 different places, and she never really got a good vibe until she came to the centre that she was in, actually, which was a TAP-funded centre. It was an integrated centre. It was a very good one. So when they came there, it was the first time she's ever left my side and gone to play. So that was really important. And then when they're there also, of course, children being active in learning and children being happy. So they want to see that their child is happy. And feedback from the teacher is important. And we know how important assessment documentation is and how important it is that is permeable or able to be read by different audiences. And so this parent here is talking about the child's portfolio and the ability to, write in it and draw hearts and all the rest, whatever they want, and it's really welcomed. And then also, of course, they like the informal feedback. They like informal talking. And I think that's probably one of the most important things is I've just done another study on continuity of early learning, which is another ministry contract, which will be published very shortly. But across the new entrant parents in new entrant classes and in early childhood, the most important piece of feedback they got from their early childhood centre was that informal talking. It was more so than what was written down. And actually having a variety of ways of informing and inviting contribution is really important. I think it's a variety of ways that appeals to those particular families. That's an equity issue. I mean, I have heard people at times say, oh, we've got a parent voice and nobody fills it in. And it's almost like blame the parents. They won't fill in the parent voice. But you've just got to gear your communication to the families that you're working with. Oh. Okay, so then... but if you think about all those messages, whether or not the centre was a good fit for the family was strongly influenced by the kind of reception that the families got and whether the welcome and also the ongoing communication was positive or negative. And here I'm talking about reducing barriers, what the engaging priority family coordinators did to reduce barriers to participation. And one of the things we came up with was this idea of brokering. And brokering was to ensure that they found and sorted out a centre or service that was going to suit that family needs. So it could be culturally it was suitable, or it could be they would not look at ones that cost too much. They would look at all the issues about transport and that kind of thing. There was also a way of translating the knowledge to something that that family could understand, helping them to have the know-how to negotiate the systems, and also passing down practical skills. We also found that with the engaging priority family coordinators, that often they were working with the whole family on a whole range of issues before they even started talking about early childhood education. So there might be housing issues or budgeting problems or all sorts of things that they could help the family with. And that came first, and then early childhood maybe came after that. And we got these quotes about brokering. If you look at those two, they both talk about the idea of translation, so you're acting as a translator. And I like the one by Mayl there, which is that brokered knowledge is knowledge made more robust, accountable, usable, knowledge that serves locally at a given time, knowledge that has been and reassembled. So I guess that was something that we saw coming through strongly. And here in this quote from a parent is how that worked for her in a way. It was the EPF coordinator or caseworker taking the parent to have a look at different centres, actually going with her. And that parent said, I thought it was just a waste of time at first, but in the end, she realised it was to show me and make me feel comfortable in that situation. And this was a parent who was a bit reluctant or not sure about her children attending early childhood. Oh, I'm going to be finished before long, actually. That's all right, eh? I thought I didn't have enough to say, but I had too much to say. So these were what we called successful participation initiative providers. They were based in the community and they had access to a range of family services. So they were really adept at linking with those services, and some of them provided additional services as well. And for example, an integrated early childhood centre also had its own health services, so they were sort of in the same area. So it had a very good health available for the families. They took a holistic view of families, and I think I've said that. They didn't just pick out early childhood education and we want bums on seats and tick our boxes. They saw families holistically. They had a really sound professional base. They had a range of expertise, and they often linked coordinators with families in terms of a cultural match. Okay. So here are some of my ideas about some of the policy challenges that have come from that. And I think one of the issues for me, these are my personal views, is coverage. And when I first got this project, I was a bit worried about singling out families and calling them priority families and whether that would stigmatise those families. My eyes have been open to some of the really difficult situations that families live in. So I don't know. I certainly think that low-income communities require the absolute best possible early childhood services there are, and they probably require additional support to enable that to happen. So coverage, though, is an issue because priority families, as they're called, are not only in those communities that have been part of this initiative. Priority families are all over New Zealand. And I guess so we need a kind of universal approach that will work for everybody. Cost is an issue. That was that significant barrier. Every time it is a significant barrier. And I've talked to people internationally who are amazed because they think, oh, New Zealand's got free early. Peter Moss has one. He writes about New Zealand's free early childhood, and I tell him, no, it's actually not necessarily free. And I think if you look at other countries, they do things about costs like they cap fees at a certain level. And they also require, local body or government to make an entitlement to free early childhood for children. So here it's not an entitlement, it's if you can find a centre, that will take you and give you those free hours, then you have it. But it's not an entitlement in the sense that in some of the Scandinavian countries, there's an entitlement to early childhood. I think planning is absolutely necessary to ensure that there's good quality early childhood throughout the country, and it's locally available as well. I think the evaluation and also some international literature has shown really clearly that when centres are integrated with wider services to support families, then they often do a really good job in terms of attracting people to come and use them. And I think that integrated model could be extended. There was a model some time ago under a different government, but as soon as the national-led government came into power, it stopped the funding for that. I think the cultural responsiveness to Māori and Pacifica families came through as really important, and there were some really good examples within the TAP-funded centres of strong connections being made with iwi and cultural organisations, and I know lots of people do that in their centres anyway, but this is something that I think is really important. And I think the most important thing, though, is a focus on quality, that we shouldn't just be looking at participation, but we need to have, hand in hand with participation, we need to be boosting the quality of early childhood services. And I thought we were doing quite well on that in terms of, the 100% qualified teacher requirement for teacher-led services and the kind of professional resources, keitua o te pai, and professional development and centres of innovation. Those were really wonderful ways that were being used to strengthen quality. And what we've got now is much more focus on participation. I don't think it's bad that there is a focus on participation, but you also need a focus on quality. So I'm going to end with a cautionary story, and it's about our services are provided in what we call a mixed market economy, and there are plenty of other countries in the world that operate in this kind of way. So the UK, the Netherlands, United States, Canada, Australia, African continent, and some parts of Asia and Pacific. And so the idea in a mixed market is that the state, private, for-profit and community-based services all play a role in provision. Now, the state actually is not a direct provider except for the correspondence school, Te Kura. So it's community-based and for-profit or private provision. And we also have, in several countries and in New Zealand, corporate providers where the commercial interest is in making a profit for owners or shareholders. And the whole idea behind this sort of model is that parents will vote with their feet if a centre is not good quality or their child is not happy, they'll leave and they'll go somewhere else. But we know actually that's not so easy to do. Because children make connections with people, because, accessibility is an issue and so on. And so there's been a lot of concern about the spread of the private sector. And if you look at the figures in New Zealand, they've steadily increased since 1992. and particularly now in the education and care and home-based sector, they are the lion's share of provision. And I don't think all private centres are bad or anything, because I know there's some excellent ones. It's the idea of making money out of education, which is not going directly back into the service, that is a real concern. And so that book there that is up on the slide was brought together by Eva Lloyd and Helen Penn from the University of East London, and I wrote a chapter in the book on New Zealand, and there's chapters from all those other countries. So the countries are very different, but this was one of the overall messages that came through from all of those different chapters, that marketisation and privatisation risk deepening, consolidating or widening inequalities of access and driving qualitative differences between providers. Now I've done some research in New Zealand looking at differences in quality, differences in employment of qualified teachers, and where services are located. And what we find is that private providers tend to invest in areas where they can make money, so they don't tend to go to the low income areas unless there's extra funding to be gained from doing that, and also tend to have poorer quality. And so in the national survey I did when I worked for NZCER, the private centres had significantly lower employment of qualified teachers in education and care centres than the community centres. And I'm sure people remember the ABC, which came to Australia not so long ago, and which researchers from Charles Sturt University called the giant in the playground. Because what happened was, it was bought by Eddie Groves of ABC Learning and his wife. They expanded incredibly rapidly in Australia. They expanded so rapidly that they became the major provider in some small local communities. So if you wanted your child to go to early childhood, it had to be an ABC centre, because that's all there were. They bought a lot of centres. They also had very standardised policies, and I know they had a curriculum that you could pull down. So, I'd like to have te whāriki in my centre. You could pull down a program for the day to tell you what to do, which of course is not our curriculum, but that was the kind of thing they were doing. So the curriculum was becoming very narrow. They had training that they themselves provided, which also was narrow. They had a toy company, an equipment company, and the ABC centres had to buy the equipment from this company. And so they were squeezing out local providers. They became the biggest corporate provider in the world. They came to New Zealand, as you would know, and they were moving into Hong Kong and Canada and the United States. And then in November 2008, they had overreached themselves and they collapsed. And then there was a real dilemma for the Australian government, because those centres had a lot of families who needed to use them. So the Australian government actually kept them open. They paid 56 million Australian dollars over a 2-month period until owners were, new purchasers came and bought up the centres. And I think it's very interesting that, as well as that, a lot of shareholders lost money because they were listing on the share market, so they lost all that money. It's interesting that who bought them up was an organisation called Good Start, which is comprised of 9 community-based organisations who've made a consortium, and they're making efforts to improve quality across all their 600 Good Start centres. So my caution is, could something like this happen in New Zealand. And people will know that Evolve is a publicly listed company that came into being, was at the end of last year. It bought up Lollipops, it bought up Horse, Homebased, and it's bought up quite a few other centres that I've heard about. I wrote an opinion piece in the Herald and have heard from one of the teachers, a qualified teacher who works in one of the centres, about what happened when Evolve purchased their centre. Their centre was quite good, she had thought. It had a ratio of 1:3 for under 2-year-olds and a ratio of 1:8 for over 2-year-olds. The fees for parents were quite high. So the first thing that happened was the ratios were changed to 1:5 and 1:10, because that was permissible to go. And then the staffing was also changed so that the people who were usually in the baby room when the parents and the babies arrived, they were all put together in the toddler room so that staffing costs could be reduced. So it's a very unhappy situation. And I guess it's a kind of thing that we can expect if we've got early childhood centres bought by publicly listed companies whose first duty as directors are to the shareholders. Their first duty is to make a dividend for shareholders. So what can we do about it? Well, I look at what happened in Australia was a good start, and I think that's a magnificent thing that happened. And not so long ago, Helen May and I were part of a group of 9 community organisations, national organisations. We were trying to get another agenda about early childhood going. We wrote this report based on the deliberations of the project team, Strengthening Community-Based Early Childhood in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think it's time that the community sector stood up and thought about what could be done and how we could lobby and advocate as a collective body, because it's very hard when it's just 1 or 2 lone voices doing that. So that's a bit of a gloomy note to end on. Not the quality public education, but the dangers to New Zealand. But I do see it as getting more and more difficult for some very good community centres, and we need to turn the tide and make a change. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
My name is Angel. I'm a lecturer here. I have the privilege to be the discussant of this presentation for Linda Mitchell. So I'm not sure whether I can do justice to your presentation. Yeah. It's fascinating findings, and I can't help but compare your finding to the findings of my doctoral research to a certain extent, because I worked with immigrant families.
Yes.
They are the minority families as well, with my understanding. So I think it talks a lot about, it's very well to have all this initiative, but without the support mechanism to help these parents, they really do not know where to go or what needs to be done. The barrier you talked about a lot of misunderstanding, and I can feel that there's a lot of assumption from the teachers as well. The parents not knowing the expectations of the centre.
Yeah.
You talk about the families appreciate the portfolio. The families that I interviewed, they said they have no idea that the child is a portfolio, or they are expected to contribute to the learning stories with the parent's voice. So just shows that there's a lack of understanding or a mismatch, the word that you use. I talk about a misalignment between the centre's expectation and the parental aspiration.
Yeah.
And then the big questions would be, of course, do parents really need to send their children to early childhood centres if they've got extended families at home, grandparents at home to look after the children?
Yeah.
These grandparents, they have a lot of tons of knowledge to share with the child to help to maintain the home language, the home culture. That's something to think about as well. It seems that the strategies that teachers may want to consider would be try to help these families to develop a sense of belonging to the centres. They feel welcome in the centres. They feel their values are being embraced and respected, rather than feel that they are disempowered or their cultural practice or the cultural values have no status or no value in the setting. I think that would be
that would be right.
The concept of brokering is very interesting because you talk about how this broker can translate the knowledge.
Yeah.
With my research, that is a real translation issues for the parents because they speak Chinese only. So it's not just about the translation of the knowledge, it's also about the language itself.
Yeah.
Cultural responsiveness, pedagogy, this is, we talk about it quite often now. The key thing would be avoid a tokenistic measure, putting those different language greetings up on the wall. It doesn't really mean a lot to the parents. It's all about the attitudes, I would say. And this whole thing about neoliberalism, marketization, globalization, we will, I don't know how we can deal with it, but it surely has widened the gap between the have and the have-nots.
Great.
Okay, maybe we'll get you guys to ask individuals some questions as well.
Linda, I have a question about brokering. Did you find that any of your families have children with special needs? And if so, did you find that GSE were doing the brokering?
No, not in the...
Because we find quite a lot that they are the ones that take the parents around the centres. Bring them in and introduce them and make them feel comfortable and I think channel people into services as well.
If they have access to that, and not all families do. I know there's a lot of people, not a lot of people, there's a few people in the audience, one who've worked in centres that are really rich in terms of responding to culturally diverse families, and also been involved in some of these initiatives, and you might want to make comment as well. Can we turn that off or not really? And then I can move. You see, I get the light in my eye otherwise. Thanks. Yeah. You might be standing there.
I would just like to, I'm speaking from a provider of engaged and priority families. When you're talking about it's important to send children to early childhood education, the families that we work with a high risk initiative, Engaging Priority Families, was that the highest truancy rate in primary sector is 5 and 6-year-old children. Now that's not the child, that is the parent not having that sound understanding of the value of education. So one of the things that we do as a provider is to foster relationships with the teaching staff so that parents get to have that understanding that education, that teachers, they're okay. They're not scary that my child isn't going to outgrow me because they know more than I do. Most of our parents, a lot of our parents can't read or write. So it's very daunting for them to actually go into an educational environment. So yes, in my way of thinking, it's vital that these children, that 3 to 5-year-olds do go to early learning centres, experience positive interactions, learn what it's like to play, because children don't know how to play. We also work with adults who have been in, living off the streets, so they're young mums with babies, like 17, 18-year-old babies. We've got them on our site at ATWC. They come into an early learning centre. They're supposed to be there supporting their children to play, but they sit there, they forget about their children, and they are playing themselves. So they haven't had that experience. So they're playing, they're drawing, they're building blocks. You know, it's like you've got to start when they're 3 so they understand. And as far as brokering goes,
keep going, very good.
but as far as brokering relationships, going and supporting the whānau, it wouldn't happen if we didn't step out there, if we didn't step out and say, it's okay, we will take you. We've had some extremely great success stories where a family of 8, a mum with 8 children, no, don't need to go to ECA, no. The coordinator managed to convince her to send her child to ECA. Now she's a huge advocate of education, and she's now going to learn to read and write herself because she wants to keep up with her children. Education is the key to poverty. So, you know, it's really important. This initiative is very important, and it needs to be tweaked slightly. And I totally agree that, you know, with what you're saying about everything that we've said, but, and have been very lucky to be involved in the research. So I'm going to
So in a way, if we had integrated centres in communities, they could play that brokering role, because they would have a whole range of ways to come into the early childhood centre, which might not be initially through the education route, it might be through something else, you know. And I guess that's one of my concerns, is that it's a bit like social work, that you always have to have that individual person, whereas if you had an established centre, and then kind of word of mouth gets around that this is a good place for families, and I just think it's probably a model that I quite like, yeah.
What other kind of services to integrated?
I can't hear you.
What other kind of services to integrated centres offer? You talked about health, but what other kind of services are you talking about?
Oh, talk about
Integration, yeah. So health.
Okay, well there was one, like it was a Pacifica Centre, and it had a Pacifica Health Trust as well, and so that was the one I just mentioned then. There was another, and so they had regular attention to children's health, and also free health services for families, that kind of thing, as well as there was a Tongan language education and care centre, and a playgroup as well, so they had a variety of provisions. Now there was another really good centre, it didn't so much have provisions on site, but it brought in, you know, people do this, the mobile dental clinic, and the people running it had connections within the community, very strong, so they had access to community support. which was iwi-based, where the curriculum was based on that local iwi, the knowledge from that iwi, and it was a really amazing kind of positive boost for the Māori families who were using that early childhood centre to find out about their own local stories and knowledge, and it made use of a whole lot of community networks. So I'm seeing integrated as more than an early childhood education, standalone. It's got access to, and in a way that's what you were doing and you're brokering, because they had those relationships very strongly, and when it was effective, it was really amazing. We have amazing stories from families about how it revolutionised their life, actually, coming into these, into contact with people like Anne and the coordinators, yeah.
Did that also extend to employment services and WINS did it also extend to employment services, WINS and different government services for the...
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah. A lot of contact, WINS and particularly, and other government services. You would say more about that?
I think for us, we at AGWC provide a holistic approach. So we've got Family Start, which is 3 months pregnant, up until 3 years old, and we will tap into their child when they turn 3. So we work with them. We also have social workers, child safety therapists, counsellors, and we also then integrate them into the primary schools, because we have social workers in schools. So the family doesn't get to drop through the loop. Most of my coordinators will advocate strongly at working income, because although working income doesn't actually offer you information, it's not. We've got to take that information to them and say, I want. But even taking a child and their parent to a doctor's appointment can be extremely daunting for the parent, and we will go with them. And it's helping them to feel better about themselves, so empowering them to make positive decisions because they see positive outcomes.
And you would kind of tail off. I mean, you would not create dependency.
No, it's all about
that
empowerment.
is really
Empowerment.
yeah.
But it's also, you're working, sorry, at the very beginning, you are actually doing, then you're walking beside them, then you're walking behind them, so that you're empowering them to make the positive decisions themselves, but you're always there to give them that bit of support. So it's quite intense at first.
This one upstairs. I've got a loud voice, so I can see. You mentioned that a lot of families don't, what I think you mentioned most of the time is centres that run around the basic day, the work day, but you haven't mentioned what those families who possibly don't want to come to those centres, what do you think, what sort of support would you suggest that they should get? Some early education that doesn't sit around the day, those parents that want to stay at home and have other cultural reasons to be with their children. Do you suggest any other way that they should be supported?
So the strategy is to support those families that prefer to stay at home or stay away from the EC centres
And do education a different way. And the other question is...
Oh, the strategies. Oh, okay.
Yes.
So we did find actually quite a lot of the Pacifica families wanted their children at home, partly because of the language being spoken at home. And those families particularly liked supported playgroups where the home language was spoken and they could be with their child. So that actually worked quite well for them. Yeah.
And the other thing is, Australia's just started investing in all peers for those people that do shift work and don't want to place their children in work hours and have different hours. What do you think about that?
Do you want to say that again, sorry?
Australia has just decided, the Australian government has just decided to invest in all pairs for people who work shifts and other hours, and so they want their children combined at different times of the day. What do you think about investing in all pairs as an education solution? right? What she's saying? Yes.
Nanny.
Like doing flexible.
Yeah, well, we do have the Homebased initiative amongst the participation initiatives. That's the one that made me most uneasy in a way, to be honest, because I kind of have a little bit of a problem to say, oh, you need to send your child to early childhood education, go to Homebased, you know, have another family look after your child. It seemed to be, it wasn't working as well as the other supported play group, the good integrated centres, the engaging priority families, where there were good providers. The flexible, responsive home-based was more like you get your friend to look after your child, and then the caregiver gets the support of a coordinator. So some of those parents were saying, but we want the support of the coordinator, not the caregiver. Do you see what I mean? Yeah.
So you don't think it's very
So they were looking for
it's not a strong solution, you know.
more support. Yeah. But the good one, you know, there was one area where it was working quite well, where the home-based caregiver had to attend a level 3 qualification training, and that was actually paid for by the provider, and then they had to bring the children once a week to the playgroup where there were qualified teachers and the coordinator also working. That situation seemed to work quite well. Yeah.
So is it correct that the Pacifica families, if they prefer to be with the children in those Pacifica play groups, they may also enjoy the social environment there, where they can be part of and talk to the other parents and share
that was very
parenting
important
concerns
in the play group. That was really important because they had a social network and their culture was upheld, and they had a good time themselves and all of that kind of thing. In fact, you know, I've done an evaluation when ECD was around of playgroups in New Zealand, and one of the recommendations we made was that people wanted support from a coordinator, preferably a qualified teacher. And it would have been so easy, even if they're not at every session, to have had a kind of mobile qualified teacher going around supporting that playgroup. And those playgroups, you know, were very empowering for families. And some of them, it was the opportunity to get out of the house and to meet other adults and just see their children happily, you know, engaged in the playgroup as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Linda, did you hear any stories of or any reports of the participation program being a place of capture for the government in terms of pulling children into a group setting where then Incredible Years or a program like that was going to be rolled out, so that it was a way of suggesting conformity in terms of, you know, preparation for school? You didn't hear?
I mean, basically, for the engaging priority families, coordinators, they were trying to find a good centre that already existed. The TAP-funded centres, the ones that we went into, were very good, although we did have an interview with one of the providers who got quite a large grant from the government, who was very derogatory about priority families, who said they don't have any culture, their culture is poverty, which I think is an absolutely shocking thing to say. But I'm not, this was not the norm. And I guess along with that was the idea of the van collecting children, and I've raised concerns about that because what it can mean is that the family has no contact with the early childhood teachers. On the other hand, some families are desperate to have a break and for their child to go, and the van is a mechanism to get them there. But I think if that is happening, you need some way of teachers and families communicating. And it might be home visits, might it, Maria? It could be, in one case the van driver was a teacher, so the teacher would talk to the families, and then the portfolios would go back and forth on the van. But it did raise an issue, a real issue for me. Having a regular use of a van. One of the integrated centres that I talked about, the one that had all the networks, said that the parents had asked for a van, and they had said, well, we might think about that, but we're not going, we want to see you too, and so it will be, we'll pick up you and your child, not just be a pick up and drop off service. But the parents loved it, they loved it. The van came at 9:15 and dropped the kid off at 3:15, and then they would have the child all ready and waiting, and they thought it was great, yeah.
There is one of the centres, or a couple of centres that we work with have a van run, which a lot of the centres we work with have a van run, and it does defeat the purpose of the youth project by trying to build those foster relationships.
Yeah.
However, there is a couple of centres that are working really well with the van where they will pick up the children and a couple of parents at the same time, and so the parents spend a morning in the centre. And so that works really, really well, but a majority of the time it's quite challenging.
I think it's all about having that shared understanding and a trusting relationship, and then the parents will feel comfortable to utilise whatever services that's available, and they'll appreciate that.
I talked to someone recently in Canada who had similar kind of programs, and he said that the van service was used because, well, actually he talked about some children being in real danger and being at home all the time. This is extreme, but that they did a system of home visiting once a month to all the families so that the connection remained.
I'm just really interested if you have any more comments about children who come from families who are transient.
Children who come from a family
Who are transient.
I can't translate.
Who move around.
Mobile.
Things happen in people's lives and they move around a lot, and it's, I think, Anne, you probably could respond to that quite well. Could you?
So what are you actually asking about?
Well, sometimes those children actually go somewhere and then they don't get into another service, early childhood service, and I'm not saying necessarily that they have to, but I'm just wondering about what happens about their well-being within that when they move and move and move and move. And obviously some of the reasons are around what leads to the movement, and some of that could be positive and some of it actually mightn't be. So I'm just wondering, as an early childhood service, what our role would be in supporting those children and those families.
So supporting the children, the transient children that come to your
Well,
service?
how because the way that the funding and everything works, people often don't take children who come for short periods of time. People, if they come and they don't attend regularly, they take it off. All those things. So, what kind of changes do we need to happen that those children can have an equitable start?
I think for us, working with our family,
what do we have to advocate for? You know, do we have to advocate?
Policy, that rule that takes you off the road.
You know, what is our responsibility as an early childhood, you know, somebody involved in early childhood to support? Because
I think we've worked really hard with the ministry, and to be honest, we haven't got anywhere because the ministry participation and the ministry funding don't seem to work together. We've had children that have been cut off the roll because they haven't attended 3 days a week, but they're attending 2 days a week, and then they drop off. And our criteria is to get a beneficial level of attendance, which is 15 hours a week or more for that particular child. It is really frustrating because it's a catch-22. And to be honest, unless something changes with the funding criteria, nothing will happen.
so I guess my point is, how do we lobby for that change?
We are lobbying as far as
But
the
collectively, as a
providers
new
are
child
lobbying for that. I don't know. I mean, it's all about government money, and they want the best for their dollar. And if the child's not attending, then that is going to the sector, and they're not benefiting the child. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it also makes a mockery of participation.
It does. But as I said, with the special centres, we advocate, and it does work sometimes.
Yeah. I do think we have to try and work collectively, and having come from a union, working in the union for 15 years, when we did some amazing campaigns for pay parity, for more funding, for a long-term strategic plan, actually that was spearheaded by the union and all of those teachers and all of those communities talking to their parents and getting behind it. So, it's not just union, but it's collective. There's all sorts of bodies in early childhood that you can be a part of. Yeah.
Did much come through in your work about the whole definition of priority families? I'm looking at this goes wider than just early childhood because this is across all the social services.
Yeah.
I can understand if the government said we'll identify socio-economic as a category to scoop up the people we need. But having done that, what is the purpose of targeting Maori and Pacific if it's not cultural and social assimilation?
Yeah.
If you managed the worst aspects of everything under the socio-economic banner, why do you then need to go to cultural targets? And why Maori and Pacific? Did anything come through, or do you address that?
To be honest, that definition was, that was their policy definition, and I've, seen it in ERO documents too, and it's written in a rather more positive frame that it's that the priority families are children who do not succeed in achievement stakes, I guess, at school, and that a lot of those happen to be Māori and Pacifica and low income.
When I was asked to discuss
No, I mean, I feel uncomfortable about.
do you want me to read the
Yes.
ERO definition?
Okay, read it.
Because when I was asked to be the discussant, I thought, I need to know what priorities means first. So according to ERO, it says, priority learners are groups of students who have been identified as historically not experiencing success in the New Zealand schooling system.
Yeah.
And these include many Māori and Pacifica learners and those from low socio-economic background and students with special education needs. So that's the definitions from PRO.
Yeah.
But the criticism is that doesn't this just legitimate an institutionally racist curriculum?
Well, does it? Because what do you say? You say they're not succeeding because they're going into centres which are not responsive to their cultures and they're being treated really badly, and that has to change. I mean, that came through very strongly as a finding, and some centres were much better at that than others. So I don't think so. I think what you have to say is there are reasons why they're not succeeding, and it's the Western view and the Pākehā dominant culture which has meant that the the environments suit those people better than others, really.